Today I'm going to be showing you how to work with faux fur yarn to create the most beautiful soft throws and projects. Faux fur yarn is beautifully soft, however it is quite expensive and the balls of yarn do not have much yardage. So if you want to make a large blanket or throw, it is going to get quite expensive. However, given how soft it is, it makes for the most gorgeous scarves. So in this video, I'm going to be showing you a nifty little trick for how to get started because you cannot see your stitches when working with this kind of yarn. I'm going to show you the best stitch to use for faux fur yarns. I'm going to show you two separate methods for adding in a new ball of yarn, which can also be applied to changing color. And I'm going to show you how to weave in your ends and completely finish your project. If you wanted to recreate this blanket on my table, then I have on my website all the information for how much yarn I used and the written pattern. However, this video is not a tutorial on this blanket. It is a how to work with this yarn. When working with faux fur yarn, it is incredibly difficult to see your stitches. This is not a yarn I would recommend to beginners. Most of your project will be done by feel and feel alone. Faux fur yarn has no give. It has no real elasticity to it, and therefore, first piece of advice, go up a hook size or two from what is recommended on the ball band of your yarn. So this yarn, for instance, suggests a 10mm crochet hook. So I will be using a 12mm instead. This just keeps your stitches a little looser and it gives your project a bit more drape than it would otherwise have. Because your stitches will be nigh on impossible to see when working with this kind of yarn, I recommend for your starting chain that you team this yarn with a guide yarn. So I just have a finer weight yarn here. This is double knit. And you want to have the same tone of yarn as your faux fur. For the initial chains, we're going to be working these together. For your project, you want a guide yarn that is as close to the colour of your faux fur as possible. For this tutorial, I'm using a high contrast yarn so you can see what I'm doing. For my personal blanket, I used a dark grey. So I picked up the dark grey in this faux fur yarn and I used that as my guide. Now, unless you are really searching for it, you can't see it in the finished product. Working with a guide yarn will absolutely help you with spotting where your chains are. So for your chain row and your chain row only, we will work with both these yarns held together at the same time. So pop a slip knot onto your hook with both yarns. You'll very quickly see how difficult it is to see your stitches when using a faux fur yarn. Then you are going to chain your project as wide as you want it to be using both yarns together. You want to keep everything nice and loose. So you can see by having that guide yarn there, I can clearly see that is chain number 1. Chain number 2. Chain number 3. So you want to chain your project as wide as you want it to be. I'm only doing a really small sample, so I'm going to go ahead and chain a total of 12. So once you have chained the width that you want your project to be, you can then go ahead and cut off that guideline. Leave a nice long length so you can weave it back in later. And then for the rest of the project, we're going to be working with just the faux fur yarn. So you can drop that entirely. Now the stitch I like to use when working with yarns like this is the half double crochet. So you're going to skip the first 2 chains, find the third one if you can, and we're going to work a half double crochet into it. If you do it by feel, if you stick your finger through, that guideline will give you a real clear definition as to where these chains are. Now, before we begin, don't worry if you can't find your chains. You do not need to be perfect. It's very, very forgiving yarn. It's super fluffy. No one will notice if you have accidentally missed a chain when you're crocheting this very first row. So skip the first 2 chains, 1, 2, and into the third one, which you will find with your finger by feel. We're going to work a half double crochet. Using just the faux fur alone, we've dropped the guideline. So I'm going to yarn over, put my hook into that guideline chain, wherever it will go, catch the yarn at the back and draw it through. I will have 3 loops on my hook. 1, 2, 3. Then yarn over and draw through all 3 loops. That's your first half double crochet made. Now, if you would like to mark this gap at the end, if you stick your finger through between the skipped chains and that half double crochet that you made, you absolutely can, but you will be able to find it by feel later on, I promise. So I'm just going to go ahead and pop a stitch marker just in there. I've done it around the chains. So I know that's the chain 2. Then find your next chain. Again, it's mostly going to be through feel. So if you kind of squish your finger along the back, you'll find that guideline chain, and we'll work another half double crochet into the next chain. So yarn over, go into the next chain, draw up the yarn at the back, 3 loops on your hook, very, very fluffy loops, and then yarn over again and pull through all 3 loops. As you can see, it is impossible to see the tops of your stitches here. We have gaps in between them, but really difficult to see the tops. So we're going to work this into every chain all the way down. Use your finger at the back to feel the next chain. And as I say, don't worry if you skip one, it really doesn't matter. And we're just going to work a half double crochet into that next chain. And you're going to do this all the way along. Find the next chain and make a half double crochet in it. So here's how you'll be looking at the end. Now, this multicolored yarn I'm working with actually makes it reasonably okay to spot the tops of your stitches. However, on my personal project, here is how the top of my stitches look. Almost impossible to identify the individual stitches themselves. So for the second row, and this is the row you'll repeat throughout your entire project, you're going to chain 2, just straight up, 1, 2, and then turn your work. Now this entire row is done by feel, and we're going to be working in between the stitches themselves, and we're going to forget the tops even exist. So you don't need to find the top of the stitch, you just need to find the gap in between them, and you can find that by running your finger along the back. Your finger will naturally find the gaps. These are where we're going to be working our half double crochets. So we want to find the very first gap. So here's the edge of my work, and here's the very first gap, and into that very first gap work a half double crochet. So straight into that gap, half double crochet in there. And again, if you want to mark the space in between your 2 chains and your first half double crochet, now is the time to do that. So you can take your stitch marker and just pop it around those chains. So I'm just putting it in the space at the end here. So even my poor stitch marker disappears working with this kind of yarn. So I have the stitch marker in there just around those chains. Then working all the way down your project, you want to run your finger behind your work. You'll find the stitch and then your finger will pop out in the next gap. And in that next gap, that's where we work our next half double crochet. So work a half double crochet into that gap. Run your finger behind, find the next gap, and work a half double crochet in there. Run your finger behind, find the gap, and work a half double crochet into that gap. So we're working in between the stitches. As you can see, the gaps close up once we've worked these stitches into them. So don't worry too much if you're being quite rough initially. And we're just going to keep going. Run your finger behind your work until your finger pops out in the next space in between your stitches and work a half double crochet. Again, run your finger behind your work, find the gap and work a half double crochet. You're going to keep doing this all the way down your work. Run your finger along the back, find the stitch, you'll feel it, and then your finger will pop through the gap. And that gap is where you work your next half double crochet. Once you reach the other side of your work, where your stitch marker is hidden in amongst all this fluff, you'll have your half double crochet and the chain 2 space here. Work your final half double crochet into this gap at the end. You can remove the stitch marker from that row below if you can. And that is the row we're going to repeat for the entirety of your project. You cannot see your stitches. This is all done by feel. So to recap this row that we have just done, as it is the row you're going to be doing for the entirety of your project, we're going to chain 2, 1, 2, and turn our work. Then run your finger at the back of the work and find the first gap in between the stitches and work your first half double crochet into that first space. Then if you want to mark this chain 2 space at the end here with your stitch marker, you can go ahead and pop that back in. So I'm just marking just the space. Then working all the way down, you're going to run your finger behind the work, find the next space in between the stitches, and that is where we work our half double crochets. Run your finger behind the work, find the space, half double crochet. Do that all the way down your row. When you get to the other side and you'll have this chain space marked, end that row with a half double crochet into that space. So you will keep repeating this last row back and forth until the project is the length that you want it to be. When you need to add a new ball of yarn, I want you to leave quite a long tail. You can do this at any point in your work, be it at the end or midway through. With the faux fur yarn, I like to use a magic knot to join the yarn. So you can clearly see what I'm doing. This is the yarn I used for my personal blanket. And we're just going to pretend it is a new ball of the yarn we're working with. So you want to lay your 2 strands of yarn. This is the one that we are working with, and this is a new one. We're laying them in opposite directions. Then with the new yarn, you're going to lay it over the top of the old yarn and bring it underneath. Then tie a knot. So I'm just tying a knot like so. Then with your old yarn, you want to cross over the new yarn, bring it underneath and tie a knot. I have a much slower video showing how to do a magic knot if this is too much fluff and you can't really see what I'm doing. I have linked to that video down below. Now you have your 2 knots and you're going to pull the yarn still attached to your work and the new yarn that is attached to the ball, and you're going to pull your hands apart. Those 2 knots will slide down and meet each other. Do this slowly because it is very slippery yarn and those knots will probably try and come undone. So I'm just gently pulling my arms apart and those knots are sliding in together to meet. So I've got both knots there met. Once they are together, you can pull it much, much tighter. You can also make sure those knots themselves are still nice and tight. Definitely want this to be nice and tight. The magic knot can sometimes come undone. So you want to be really, really certain that it is connected. So you can see I'm pulling really tightly here. That's not going anywhere. So that is how I connect my 2 balls of faux fur yarn. Then you want to trim off these ends. Don't cut too close to the knot because it will come undone. Leave yourself a little bit of tolerance. This yarn is very, very, very fluffy. You will not see these little tails. So I've just snipped off one. Oh, there we go. Second time lucky. And then I will snip off this other one here. I can feel the knot. I'm giving a little bit of tolerance. Then I cut my yarn. Before you go any further, double check that knot is going to hold. If you cut the tails too close to the knot, they'll just come undone. All right, that's not going anywhere. We've got this fluffy little knot. You can pick your work back up and you can continue crocheting. That little fluffy knot will disappear into your work. There it is. It's going in. There it is. It's disappeared into my stitch. And then you continue working with the new yarn. So there is the little fluffy knot, but it just becomes part of the work. So that is how you add a new ball of this faux fur yarn. If you don't like using a magic knot to attach a new ball of yarn, that's fine. You can use this alternative method instead. So just as before, I've left a nice long tail and I'm going to start my next stitch, but I'm not going to finish it. So I'm going to yarn over, go into the space in between those stitches and draw up a loop, and I've got 3 loops on my hook. I'm then going to let go of the yarn I'm currently working with and I'm going to bring in the new ball of yarn. Again, leave a long tail because we're going to be weaving those in. Place that over your hook and draw that through the 3 loops on your hook. So we've attached a new ball of yarn. You'll have these 2 tails here. Now, I still advise doing a knot. So we're going to knot these 2 together. So I'm being quite gentle. That first knot was a gentle one. I don't want to distort my stitches by pulling too hard. I've done a second knot there, so I've got a little double knot in my work. And then these two tails, I'm going to crochet over them as I continue, just for a few stitches. So for a few stitches, I'm going to work over them and sandwich them into my project. So I've crocheted over them. I've got a little bit of length still left, so I'm going to leave them to the side. And then crochet a couple more rows before we deal with these. Once you've done a couple more rows, you want to grab a large eye darning needle. I find the cheap plastic ones actually work the best for this faux fur yarn. And then you're going to thread up each tail individually. And then work back in the opposite direction that you crocheted over them. So I crocheted over them in this direction. You see the little bit of purple poking out. And when I go back in, I'm going to go over this pink stitch here and then under the others. So I'm going back in the opposite direction. Then you can run it however you can feel the stitches themselves. You just want to run these tails up and through the stitches. I'm feeling the stitches themselves and I'm just sort of splitting them as I go. And the same for your other tail. You want to go over the stitch you came out from. You can fluff them back up. This one is going to be super noticeable because it's a totally different yarn. So I'm going to go over and I'm doing the same thing. I'm coming under these stitches. And then you can run them down and through your half double crochets on any of the rows above or below. You can trim off the ends once they've been woven in. Careful not to cut the yarn itself. And your little knots from either the magic knot or from doing a traditional color change type joining of the yarn ball, you can't feel them and you can't see them. Once your project is the length that you want it to be and you have completed your final half double crochet of the entire project, to finish, you're going to chain one, cut your yarn, leaving a nice long length to weave in. Pull that all the way up and out, pull it tight, and then weave in this final end in the same way that you wove in these ones where we have changed color. So I'm just threading it onto the needle and I'm coming down, I'm splitting the stitches and running in the opposite direction to the way I was crocheting. I'm coming underneath the base of these stitches. And then you can run it down and along. Don't forget to do exactly the same thing with your starting tail. So your guide yarn, do the same thing, and this tail from your slip knot. Then your faux fur project will be complete. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I do hope my tips help you out if you want to create a faux fur project of your own. It is so soft. I can't even begin to describe how soft your finished item will be. It's absolutely heavenly. So until next time, happy crocheting. Bye.